Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that a single Canadian engineer sitting in a control room 500 kilometers north of New York City possesses more power over American economic stability than the President of the United States? And what if I told you that this individual, whose name most Americans will never know, can shut down Wall Street, paralyze the New York Stock Exchange, and plunge 20 million people into darkness with the press of a single button? Most people believe that electrical power systems are domestic infrastructure controlled by national governments and local utility companies. They assume that American cities receive electricity from American power plants operated by American workers under American oversight. They do not recognize what I recognize: the complete subordination of American urban civilization to Canadian energy control, executed through power transmission systems so integrated that Canadian operators can determine whether American cities have light, heat, and the electrical power necessary for basic survival. This is not theoretical vulnerability. This is operational reality that places the economic heart of America at the mercy of foreign decision-makers who answer to Canadian interests rather than American needs. The James Bay Hydroelectric Complex in northern Quebec represents one of the largest power generation systems ever constructed by human civilization. And its strategic importance cannot be overstated in terms of North American energy security and Canadian leverage over American urban centers. This vast network of dams, reservoirs, and generating stations stretches across an area larger than many European countries, harnessing the power of rivers that flow north toward Hudson Bay through some of the most remote and pristine wilderness areas on Earth. The complex consists of multiple interconnected facilities that work together as a single integrated system capable of producing over 16,000 megawatts of electrical power during peak generation periods. This massive output makes the James Bay system larger than most countries' entire electrical generation capacity, and comparable to the combined output of 20 large nuclear power plants operating simultaneously. To put this in perspective, the James Bay system produces more electricity than all nuclear power plants in the United Kingdom combined, more than the entire electrical generation capacity of countries like Switzerland or Austria, and enough power to supply the electrical needs of approximately 12 million average American households. The engineering achievement represented by the James Bay Complex is remarkable, not just for its scale, but for its strategic positioning within the North American electrical grid system. The complex was designed and constructed specifically to export large quantities of electrical power to markets in the American Northeast, creating permanent dependency relationships that have evolved into the foundation of Canadian economic leverage over American urban centers and American financial institutions. But the scale of power generation tells only part of the story. The critical factor is where this electricity flows and who depends on it for their daily survival and economic prosperity. Through a network of high-voltage transmission lines spanning hundreds of kilometers, James Bay. Electricity flows directly into the heart of the American Northeast, powering cities from Boston to New York to Washington, D.C. New York State alone imports approximately 3,200 megawatts of Canadian electricity daily, representing 20% of the state total electrical consumption during normal demand periods, and up to 30% during peak summer cooling seasons when air conditioning systems place maximum stress on electrical distribution networks. This Canadian power flows through high-voltage transmission lines that cross the international border at multiple points and connect directly to the New York electrical grid, making Canadian electricity indistinguishable from domestic generation once it enters American distribution systems. The scale of this dependency becomes even more dramatic when examining specific regions and urban centers within New York State. New York City itself, with its 8.4 million residents and countless businesses, financial institutions, and critical infrastructure facilities, receives approximately 800 megawatts of its electrical supply directly from Canadian sources during average demand conditions. During peak demand periods in summer months, when air conditioning systems strain the electrical grid, Canadian imports can represent 25-35% of New York City's total electrical consumption. The Manhattan Financial District, which houses the nerve center of the global financial system and processes transactions worth trillions of dollars daily, receives a substantial portion of its electrical power from Canadian sources through the same transmission lines that serve residential and commercial customers throughout the New York metropolitan area. The New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ trading systems, major investment banks including Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase, and trading firms that determine global market conditions all operate using electrical power that includes substantial components generated at Canadian facilities under Canadian control. The timing of peak electrical demand creates particularly acute vulnerability because Canadian power imports become most critical precisely when electrical system failures would cause the most severe economic and social disruption. During summer heat waves, when temperatures exceed 32 degrees Celsius for multiple consecutive days, electrical demand in New York can increase by 40-50% above normal levels as air conditioning systems operate continuously to maintain habitable indoor temperatures. The individuals who control this massive flow of electrical power that determines the basic functioning of American urban centers are not American government officials or American utility executives operating under American oversight and American policy direction. They are Canadian engineers working for Hydro-Quebec, a Canadian Crown corporation that operates according to Canadian policy priorities, Canadian strategic interests, and Canadian government directives that may conflict with American needs or American economic priorities. These engineers sit in sophisticated control rooms located in Montreal and other Quebec facilities, monitoring advanced computer systems that provide real-time information about power generation, transmission line capacity, electrical demand patterns, and system stability throughout the interconnected electrical grid that spans eastern Canada and the northeastern United States. From their monitoring stations, these Canadian operators can observe electrical demand fluctuations in New York City, track power consumption patterns at major American financial institutions, and identify system vulnerabilities that could be exploited to maximize the impact of any decision to reduce or eliminate power exports to American markets. The senior control room operator at Hydro-Quebec's System Operations Center possesses the technical authority and operational capability to reduce or suspend power exports to the United States within seconds of receiving instructions from Canadian government officials or Hydro-Quebec senior management. This individual, whose decisions are governed by Canadian regulations, Canadian emergency procedures, and Canadian political directives, can affect American electrical supply more directly and more immediately than most American government officials, American utility managers, or American emergency response coordinators. The decision-making process for power export restrictions operates entirely within Canadian institutional frameworks and Canadian policy priorities. There are no American approval requirements, no consultation procedures with American authorities, and no advanced notification systems that would provide American officials with warning of impending power supply restrictions. Canadian operators can implement power export reductions for reasons ranging from routine equipment maintenance to system emergencies to political disputes between Canadian and American governments. And American officials may not learn of these decisions until electrical supply disruptions are already affecting American cities and American economic operations. The mathematical reality of this dependency becomes clear when examining what would happen if Canadian electricity exports were suddenly interrupted or reduced. New York's electrical system operates on the principle of real-time balance between electricity generation and electricity consumption. Every second of every day, the amount of electricity being produced must exactly equal the amount of electricity being consumed, or the entire system becomes unstable and begins failing. When Canadian power exports are reduced or eliminated, American generating stations must immediately compensate by increasing their own output to maintain system balance. However, American power plants cannot instantly increase production to replace thousands of megawatts of Canadian imports. Most American generating facilities require hours or even days to bring additional capacity online, creating a dangerous gap between available power and electrical demand that can cause system-wide failures. The 2003 Northeast blackout provides a preview of what happens when electrical systems become unstable due to sudden changes in power supply and demand. That blackout, which began with a relatively minor transmission line failure in Ohio, cascaded across the entire Northeast electrical grid, affecting over 50 million people and causing billions of dollars in economic losses. The blackout demonstrated how quickly electrical system failures can spread across wide geographic areas when backup systems become overwhelmed. A deliberate reduction in Canadian power exports would create a much more severe version of the same systemic instability that caused the 2003 blackout. Instead of a localized equipment failure that gradually spread across the network, the sudden loss of thousands of megawatts of Canadian power would create immediate, widespread instability that could collapse the entire Northeast electrical grid within minutes rather than hours. The cascading effect would begin in areas with the highest dependence on Canadian imports, particularly New York City, and surrounding metropolitan areas where millions of people depend on electrical systems for basic survival and economic activity. As electrical demand exceeded available supply, automatic protection systems would begin shutting down transmission lines and electrical substations to prevent permanent damage to expensive equipment that could take months or years to replace. These automatic shutdowns would redirect electrical load to other parts of the network, immediately overwhelming those systems and causing additional failures in a domino effect that would spread across the entire northeastern electrical grid. Each system failure would increase the burden on remaining operational systems, creating a cascade of overloads, and shutdowns that would accelerate as backup systems became overwhelmed by electrical loads they were never designed to handle. Within 15-20 minutes of a complete cutoff of Canadian power exports, major portions of the Northeast electrical grid would experience total system collapse, affecting tens of millions of people across multiple states. New York City would be plunged into complete darkness, with 8.4 million residents suddenly finding themselves without electrical power for lighting, heating, air conditioning, elevators, subway systems, traffic control, water, pumping stations, or any of the countless electrical systems that modern urban life depends upon for basic survival and safety. The financial district would lose power immediately, shutting down trading systems, banking networks, communication systems, and data processing centers that handle trillions of dollars in daily transactions and maintain the technological infrastructure of the global financial system. The New York Stock Exchange would cease operations, NASDAQ trading would stop. Banking transactions would be suspended, credit card processing would fail, ATM networks would go offline, the economic heart of America would simply stop functioning. Subway systems throughout New York City would come to an immediate halt, trapping passengers in underground stations and tunnels until emergency evacuation procedures could be implemented using backup power systems that would themselves be overwhelmed by the scale of the emergency. Elevators in thousands of buildings would stop operating, potentially trapping people between floors and structures throughout the metropolitan area. Traffic control systems would fail completely, creating immediate gridlock as intersections lost signal control and traffic management systems went offline. Emergency services would be overwhelmed by simultaneous calls from millions of people, while their own communication and dispatch systems struggled to operate on backup power that was never intended for extended operations during citywide emergencies. The economic impact would be measured not in millions, but in tens of billions of dollars, as the heart of American financial markets shut down and remained offline for hours or potentially days, while engineers worked to restore system stability and restart generating facilities. Every hour that New York remained without power would cost the American economy approximately $2.4 billion in lost productivity, canceled transactions, and emergency response expenses. The human impact would be equally severe. 20 million people in the New York metropolitan area would find themselves without electrical power for lighting, heating, air conditioning, refrigeration, and the countless other electrical systems that modern urban life depends upon. During summer months, when air conditioning systems are essential for survival in urban environments, prolonged power outages would create life-threatening conditions for elderly residents, people with medical conditions, and anyone unable to evacuate affected areas. The strategic implications extend beyond immediate humanitarian concerns to encompass fundamental questions about American national security and American ability to maintain critical infrastructure independence. The reality that Canadian officials can shut down American cities reveals a level of foreign control over domestic American systems that has no precedent in American history outside of wartime occupation. Canadian control over American electrical supply creates opportunities for economic coercion that go far beyond traditional trade disputes or diplomatic pressure. During negotiations over trade agreements, environmental policies, or other issues where American and Canadian interests conflict, Canadian officials possess the ability to impose immediate and devastating costs on American economic centers by restricting electrical exports. The threat does not require actual implementation to be effective. The mere possibility that Canadian power exports could be interrupted creates powerful incentives for American policymakers to accommodate Canadian preferences on issues that might otherwise be viewed as purely domestic American concerns. American negotiating positions become constrained by the need to maintain Canadian cooperation on electrical supply, even when American strategic interests might be better served by more confrontational approaches. The psychological impact on American policymakers has been profound, but largely unacknowledged in public discussions of American energy security. Officials who understand American dependence on Canadian electricity find themselves managing policies with constant awareness that Canadian retaliation through power supply restrictions could cause more immediate damage than most military threats. Financial institutions in New York have begun incorporating Canadian power supply risk into emergency planning procedures. Major investment banks have established backup facilities and locations with more diverse electrical supply sources, but these cannot fully replace the infrastructure concentrated in Manhattan financial centers. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, responsible for American monetary policy and financial system stability, operates using power that includes substantial Canadian imports. The institution responsible for American monetary sovereignty depends on electricity supplied by a foreign government that could restrict it without warning. The Department of Homeland Security has classified Canadian electrical supply as critical infrastructure, acknowledging that American national security depends on maintaining Canadian cooperation on energy exports. This classification represents a fundamental admission that American government operations and American economic systems cannot function independently of foreign energy supplies and foreign policy decisions. The military implications are equally concerning. Military installations throughout the Northeast, including strategically important facilities involved in national defense, and homeland security operations, depend on electrical power from the same grid systems that receive Canadian imports. While military facilities typically maintain backup generators for emergency operations, these systems are designed for temporary use during brief outages rather than sustained operations during prolonged power supply interruptions. The vulnerability extends to communication systems, transportation networks, and emergency services that are essential for coordinating responses to national security threats or natural disasters. During any crisis requiring coordinated government response, the effectiveness of American emergency management would be compromised by dependence on electrical systems that Canadian officials could disrupt at their discretion. The technological sophistication of modern electrical control systems creates additional vulnerabilities that go beyond simple decisions to reduce or eliminate power exports. Canadian control room operators possess detailed real-time information about American electrical demand patterns, system vulnerabilities, and backup capacity limitations. This information could potentially be used to maximize the impact of power supply restrictions by timing them to coincide with periods of peak American electrical demand or reduced backup generating capacity. Canadian engineers who operate power export systems understand American electrical infrastructure better than most American utility officials, because they must coordinate their operations with American grid systems to maintain stable power transmission. This technical knowledge provides Canadian operators with insights into American system vulnerabilities that could be exploited for maximum economic and social impact during any dispute or crisis. The automated systems that manage power transmission between Canada and the United States are designed to respond immediately to changing conditions and operator commands. Canadian control room operators can redirect or reduce power flows to American markets within seconds of receiving instructions from Canadian government officials or Hydro-Quebec management. There are no American approval processes, consultation requirements, or notification procedures that could delay or prevent Canadian decisions to restrict power exports. The legal framework governing Canadian power exports provides extensive discretion for Canadian authorities to restrict electricity supply for reasons ranging from system maintenance to environmental compliance to national security concerns. Canadian officials are not required to obtain American permission or provide advance warning before implementing power export restrictions that could affect American electrical supply. During the 2025 trade dispute, Canadian officials demonstrated their willingness to use electrical leverage by implementing routine maintenance on transmission lines during periods when restrictions would have maximum impact on American systems. While technically legitimate, the timing was clearly coordinated to create pressure on American negotiating positions. The maintenance shutdowns resulted in rolling blackouts throughout New York State and reduced electrical supply to financial district operations during critical trading periods. The message was clear. Canadian control over American electrical supply could be implemented immediately whenever Canadian interests required pressure on American decision makers. The broader implications for American energy security and American strategic independence became apparent as other countries observed Canadian success in using energy leverage to influence American policy decisions. Countries that supply other forms of energy to American markets recognize that energy dependence creates political leverage that extends far beyond commercial relationships into domestic policy and strategic planning. The transformation of energy supply from market commodity to political weapon represents one of the most significant but least recognized shifts in international power relationships in the modern era. Countries that control essential energy supplies to major economies possess influence over domestic policies and international relationships that traditional diplomatic or military pressure could never achieve. Canada has demonstrated that modern urban civilization is so completely dependent on electrical power that controlling electricity supply provides more effective leverage over developed economies than most traditional forms of economic or political pressure. The Canadian engineer who sits in the Hydro-Quebec control room possesses more immediate power over American economic stability than American government officials, who lack the ability to quickly replace Canadian electrical imports. The mathematical certainty of American vulnerability to Canadian electrical control cannot be disputed by political rhetoric or policy declarations. New York needs Canadian electricity to maintain basic urban services and economic operations. Canadian officials can eliminate that electricity supply within seconds of making the decision to do so. American backup systems cannot immediately replace thousands of megawatts of Canadian power. The numbers are clear, and they reveal the complete subordination of American urban centers to Canadian energy control. This dependency represents the most sophisticated form of peacetime control that one nation has ever exercised over another developed economy. It operates through technical systems that appear apolitical and commercial relationships that seem purely economic, but it provides Canadian officials with the ability to shut down American cities and collapse American financial markets through decisions that cannot be prevented or immediately countered by American authorities. The age of American energy independence is a myth that exists only in political speeches and policy documents. The reality is, American energy dependence on Canadian supply, Canadian infrastructure, and Canadian cooperation for the electrical power that keeps American cities functioning. Most Americans do not understand this dependency, but their daily lives depend entirely on Canadian willingness to maintain the power exports that keep their lights on, their computers running, and their cities operational. The Canadian engineer in the Quebec control room may never exercise the power to plunge New York into darkness, but the mere fact that this power exists fundamentally alters the relationship between the two countries. America negotiates with Canada, not as an equal partner, but as a dependent nation whose cities can be shut down at Canadian discretion. This is how modern empires end, not through military conquest, but through the quiet recognition that they cannot survive without the cooperation of nations they once assumed they controlled.